Hey guys, how's it going? So the topic of our time today is a bit different. Abigail Williams. Abby is an incredibly bizarre addition to this game simply because she lacks a proper history. Legitimately, I could summarize everything that we know about Abigail Williams in a single paragraph, and I will. Yet we know her name and many American high school students know her name. This is due primarily to her role in the novel The Crucible, but even then, this too can be summarized with relative ease. So today we are not covering Abigail Williams. We are instead covering Abigail Williams as well as some aspects in life of Puritan Salem, including that of the practitioners of folk magic. Let's get into it. Let's start with our initial subject, Abigail Williams. Abby, as she appeared in history, was a girl who was approximately 10 or 11 years old in 1692. She lived with her relatives, the pastor of Salem, Massachusetts, Samuel Parris, his daughter Betty Parris, and their two slaves, Tituba and John Indian. Abby and Betty at some point accused 3 women in the town of Salem that their specters had visited them and tormented the children. Supposedly, these ghosts of the women poked them with pins, berated them, and beat them. These 3 women were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Both Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne denied the accusations of being a witch, while Tituba admitted to the accusations, though it was possibly done under duress. Sarah Good would go on to be executed along with a number of other people whom Abigail and a group of other children singled out, leading to the execution of 19 townsfolk. Sarah Osborne, who was old and of failing health, died while in prison. The madness in Salem lasted around a year and was only after the intervention of others showing up and essentially slapping the entire town awake from their shared insanity that the town returned to relative normalcy. Today, there are many theories possibly explaining why the events that happened in Salem did. A popular one is that it was a breakout of ergot, a fungus on grains that cause psychedelic effects, though this theory has since been proven to be incredibly unlikely. Another theory is that there was a group mental break caused by the circumstances and age that they lived, as well as the incredibly strict religious structure, or, and this is the theory that I personally subscribe to, kids being bored. It is hard to wrap your mind around in our modern age where both information and entertainment are literally always at your fingertips. You're watching it right now. We've gotten to a point where if some people are not overstimulated, they are unable to function properly. During this time period, especially in seasons when there's a whole lot of not much going on, there was nothing to do. If you weren't working, sleeping, or praying, you really weren't doing much. This isn't to say that there was no entertainment, but think of how fast a child tires of doing the same thing over and over again. So, a genuine theory is that one day Abigail Williams and Betty Parris thought up an idea to create some excitement in their lives, and after they saw how much attention they got for doing it, being interviewed and treated well, they kept up the act. Other kids saw through the nonsense and joined in, and the adults listened. I will say that while the whole from the mouths of babes thing is definitely an aspect to keep in mind and definitely influenced how some of the adults acted, the collected mass paranoia is what likely led the adults to act as they did. It didn't help that once a person that the girls accused of being a witch was selected, they would do damn near anything to make sure that the person was convicted and killed. Oftentimes, this meant that if an accused witch denied the accusations, the girls would let out a horrible shriek and complain of being attacked. Even simple movements of the accused were used against them, being believed to be a source of witchcraft to torment the girls. Now, one man really saw through this nonsense and is a name that you might recognize. Giles Corey. He is the guy who ended up getting pressed to death between 2 boards because he refused to acknowledge the court, all while only muttering more weight. Giles realized that the girls were full of it, and so in the courtroom began to make gestures on purpose just to frighten the girls and make them freak out, almost as if he believed that they couldn't keep up this charade forever. Unfortunately, he would be bound to prevent him from doing this, but in hindsight, it really lends more credence to the girls simply putting on an act. Finally, this ruse began to fall apart once the accusations began to reach people of higher power, leading these parties to functionally come in and shut down the proceedings. After this, Abigail Williams simply vanishes from history. Hey, fun fact, no one who admitted to being a witch during the Salem witch trials was executed. Only people who denied until the very end were. Changing gears just a little bit, Abigail, as she appears in The Crucible, is much older, being around the age of 17 or 18, and plays the role of a seductress trying to steal away a farmer she had an affair with named John Proctor. There is no historical evidence to suggest that this is even remotely accurate. For starters, there is a very keen lack of any sexual conversation in the Salem witch trials at all, which is somewhat rare for these kinds of proceedings. Crucible Abigail's portrayal is actually closer to a different Abby in Salem, a girl named Abigail Hobbs. Hobbs was closer to that 17 years old mark and was originally one of the accused. However, she flipped the script, admitted to being a witch, and began listing off names of other people who were supposedly witches. In doing so, she got several more innocent people killed while protecting herself in the process. She is also the only one that we know about to have alluded to anything remotely sexual in the whole of the trials, claiming that Satan had taken her body and soul. Abigail's portrayal in Fate seems to be a merging of the historical Abby and the Crucible Abby, along with some good old Lovecraftian magic to make a girl who appears innocent, wants to be perceived as innocent, but believes herself to be bad and to have done terrible things. It's also worth mentioning that the Abigail we encounter in Salem and the Abigail we encounter in Chaldea are different, the cosmic Abigail being a solution as to why Abby suddenly just vanishes from the historical record. In fact, Abigail is listed among the notable historical people who mysteriously vanished, when in reality she likely just lived out an average life in Salem. But what did that look like exactly, an average life in Salem? Well, let's start with two major aspects that influenced the lives of people in Salem, and how they directly led to the Salem witch trials. First, Satan is very real and he walks among us, and second, everyone practices magic in some variety, just not in a sense where they believed it to be harmful. Let's start with Satan. I could do an entire dissertation on the old goat with the book, but I'll save that for another time. To the Puritan mind, Satan was an ever-present and very real force that actively sought out souls to corrupt and steal. But this didn't look as permanent as it does in modern culture. One of the key tenets of the Puritan branch of Christianity was the belief that only a select few could make it into heaven, and that those numbers had already been decided, and that there was nothing you could do to get in if you weren't already on that list. The catch being, of course, that no one truly knows who is going where, unless they received a divine revelation that told them so, which was something that Puritans actively sought after. Enter Satan. Old Sam would often approach people in some form and try to strike up a deal. If that person decided to enter his service, he would do something for them in return. However, rather than eternal servitude, these transactions were much more fair, more contractual. For example, if you served Satan for a period of 10 years, he would ensure that the crops in your fields were plentiful for that amount of time. Of course, this stains your soul, and you have to do whatever Satan tells you for the period of 10 years. But you ensure prosperity for yourself and your family. Theoretically, if you were to die before this servitude was up, you would still have to serve Satan in death, or he would take your soul for his own. While a soul may have a reservation in heaven, Satan can still take that soul away before Judgment Day so that there are more empty seats. So, to the Puritan mind, any person who gained a sudden stroke of fortune or had something miraculous happen to them, such as the sudden recovery of a dying child, an incredibly prosperous harvest during a bad season, or a veritable ancient tome's worth of other signs, that person could have joined leagues with Satan to attain this, and Satan wanted your soul too. Now, after the conclusion of the witch trials, this line of thinking more or less went away for over 100 years. The various churches kind of wisened up to the idea that if you keep telling people Satan was actively on the prowl to seduce them to his dark ends, it may drive people crazy and cause another Salem to happen. Thankfully though, there hasn't been a resurgence in this Satan is alive and well mentality since then. As for the second part of this, we have folk magic. You are likely familiar with the concepts of white magic and black magic, but to summarize, white magic is beneficial and used for healing, medical, or overall beneficial means, while black magic consists of magic with a primary focus on harming something or someone. Dowsing is a perfect example of white magic, as its effects are purely beneficial and can be seen as selfless, being used to find lost items or locations to dig for wells. Meanwhile, curses are a good example of black magic, as they are done to hinder or harm a target for any one reason or another. White folk magic, not to be confused with white folk magic, it was something practiced by the people of Salem. This included the Reverend Samuel Parris, who used dowsing. But this was more or less given the pass before the trials, because everyone participated in it. In fact, in the Salem witch trials, white magic was used to attempt to remove the influence of black magic by the witches. In one example, using something called a witch cake. This was a cake made of rye and the piss of the afflicted girl, and then fed to a dog. This, according to what they believed, would redirect the affliction back to the caster, which eventually would lead to an accusation. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone was a magician trying to cast spells to heal or harm one another, but rather that if, say, your kid was sick and the doctor couldn't help him, it was a viable option to go to the folk healer instead and see if they had something that could. Usually, these would be herbs and incantations to help, but to the mind of those at the time, this was magic. So, where did this all go wrong for Salem? Well, the word of the day is coincidence. At the Salem witch trials, many people were accused of witchcraft on evidence that would have happened months, if not years prior, and be accused of practicing black magic. What a lot of accusations realistically boiled down to were petty squabbles over property issues, such as a man's ox breaking into a woman's field and trampling her crops. This was all well and good until the woman muttered that she hoped the ox choked. Lo and behold, the ox would die later on, choking on a turnip. This was used as evidence that the woman was a witch, as this curse would be black magic. And as such, she was hanged. The witch trials at Salem are filled to the brim with instances like this. This isn't even getting into something that is called spectral evidence, which was also born of the belief that there was a ghost world in which a witch could harm the living and remain entirely invisible, hence why normal folk can't see the specters. This non-corporeal evidence was used to accuse the vast majority of people killed in Salem. Anyway, that is Abby in the books. Sorry the Abby episode wasn't really about Abby, but when we're dealing with a child who vanished from history, we don't exactly have very much to go off of. Oh, and if you're wondering where Yog-Sothoth fits into all of this, I did a video on him and the other old gods already, so go check that out. For now though, check my links, do the YouTube stuff, check out the Patreon, buy the merch, keep your chin up lads, peace.